Hey folks, my name's Nick Jennison and I'm thinking about guitar, and today I'm specifically thinking about the most expensive amplifiers in the entire world. We are of course talking about Dumbles. Now, if you've been lucky enough to lay hands on a Dumble, you will know that playing through one is basically a religious experience. I've never owned one for obvious reasons. They are far out of the reach of a lowly working player like me, but I have played through one for a very short amount of time at the NAMM show. Not the best environment to evaluate how a Dumble sounds, but my goodness, it was a special amplifier. But of course, as we mentioned, they are ludicrously expensive to the point of being completely unobtainable to the likes of me and to the likes of, I'd imagine, you, unless you're the kind of person that has crazy money to throw on an amplifier such as an original Dumble Overdrive Special. But then the question becomes, can you find one? Now, I feel like VHT have come up with the answer to this conundrum in the form of the D-20. Now, this is a follow-on from their highly celebrated D-50, which is a hand-wired East Asian-made D-style amplifier that is very much cut from the cloth of the Overdrive Special. The D-20 is similar in its voice, but with a different control layout. It doesn't have all of the same features as the D-20, but it does have enough to get you all of those classic D-style tones, but at a much more affordable price point. Now, we are not going to pontificate about exactly how accurate these tones are, because this amp costs somewhere in the region of 1/20th of the price of a legit handmade by Alexander Dumble. So we're not going to worry ourselves about that. And also, I don't have the requisite experience to really give you an opinion on this, because I've never owned a Dumble, and I assume you've probably never owned one either. And most importantly, a lot of the folks on internet forums who want to tell you about this stuff have probably never owned one either. So we're going to evaluate this amp on its own merits. And we're going to begin by taking a look at a selection of tones that you can get just using the amplifier. We will throw some pedals at it later, and we'll do a full evaluation of the controls on the front panel. But first, let's do a little smattering of tones so we can see the range that this amp has and the kind of tones that we can get out of it. heard this amp in action, let's talk more about the specifications. Now, as previously mentioned, this is a 20-watt amplifier and makes use of two 6V6s in the power stage, which is a classic Fender configuration. Now, of course, the original Dumbles were modified Fenders, so that checks out. It doesn't have the DFET style input. That's been moved to a pedal, which VHT are offering separately, which means you can stack that onto your other amplifiers too. I think that's quite a nice way of doing it. So a single normal input with its own volume control, this will start to break up even at lower volumes. So as you start to push it past 12 o'clock, we start to introduce a little bit of crispiness into the tone, and then it gets quite hairy by the time it gets all the way around. Now you can offset this with the master volume, but the master volume will also introduce clipping and compression as soon as it gets past that 12 o'clock mark. And when you crank it all the way, it goes absolutely bonkers and starts to absolutely fuzz out, which is something we'll check out in a second. Now, these three switches are perhaps the most interesting part of this amplifier. These are our three voicing switches. We have a 3-position bright switch, which is neutral in the middle, and then becomes a little brighter in the top position, and then very bright indeed in the bottom position, which is wonderful for introducing sparkle into the tone if you're playing with humbuckers, also for balancing between humbuckers and single coils. And if you're a Strat player, your Strat is very bright, for example, you could go to the middle position and take some of that away. Myself personally, I like the brightest position. I like to tame that with the other parts of the amp that we'll talk about in a second. The mid switch gives you a mid boosted or mid scooped mode. There is no jazz/rock mode here, as you would see on the D-50, for example, but this is something of a facsimile of that. It gives you a similar kind of effect where we have more of a pushed mids when we have the mids up, and then we get a little bit more gain as well. When we turn the mid switch to its down position, these get a little bit more scoopy, and we also lose a little bit of additional gain, but that can be a good thing. It can be really great for sculpting some classic skanky funk tones, for example, and also does quite a good AC30 impression. Now, a deep switch is the final one of these three switches, which gives us a robust low-end boost, but also sculpts a little bit of the low mids. So this is going to affect your mid-range as much as it is the extreme sub-lows. It's a little bit like the Pultec trick, if you guys have ever played with that in post-production, where you turn the low attenuation and low boost all the way up, and you get a little bit of a slight mid-dip. Now, in terms of our EQ, we have a 3-band EQ for treble, middle, and bass. This works exactly as you'd expect, and it is, as far as I'm aware, a Fender style tone stack in that it comes before the distortion, certainly before the overdrive section, which is switchable either with the foot switch or with this control on the top. Now, this gives you a drive control and a separate level control for the drive, which means you can balance it with the input volume that we have going on over here, or you can use it to create a boost if you so desire. Now, something to be aware of is the overdrive circuit in this type of amplifier, and in this amplifier specifically, is being fed by the preamp section. So it goes preamp into overdrive. Now, this is different to most higher gain amplifiers or most channel switching amplifiers where the overdrive is being fed through the tone stack. In this instance, the tone stack and the first gain stage and all of these switches are going into the overdrive. So any tone sculpting you do here will affect the response of the gain and the amount of gain that we're getting, rather than being this big tone sculpting thing. For that, you're best looking at the presence control, which is operating on the power amp, as most presence controls are wont to do. But it does mean that you get a great deal of feel sculpting when it comes to the overdrive, and perhaps not a huge amount of actual tone sculpting. But fortunately, it's voiced very, very, very nicely and feels really great under the hands. Now, round the back, we have a very simple layout with speaker outputs, an impedance switch, we have a foot switch inlet, and finally we have a serial effects loop for inserting any wet effects or boost effects that you might want to use in the effects loop. Now, speaking of pedals, let's throw some pedals in front of this amp and see how it handles them. We're going to begin with the most ubiquitous overdrive pedal, which is the TS9. I've resisted the urge to use anything exotic because it'd be a bit facetious of us, I guess, to use a really expensive exotic overdrive pedal with what is an affordable D-style amplifier. So let's take our TS boost, we'll throw it in front of the amp without the overdrive engaged, and we'll explore the effect of these three toggle switches in particular, which are really powerful for sculpting the tone of a pedal in front of this amp. Let's take a listen. Next up, let's do the same test, but this time we're going to use a fuzz pedal. Now, I could have used an amp in a box for this, but I feel like the full frequency nature of a fuzz really highlights the performance of this amplifier when we feed it with a higher gain pedal. So to this end, we're going to use a Boss Waza FZ-1W. We're going to feed it into the front of the amp, again with the overdrive switched off, and we're going to explore the effect of our 3 toggle switches. I may play with the tone controls as well. Let's take a listen and hear how that sounds. And finally, let's explore the D20 with some big ambient effects. And for this, we're going to use a Strymon Timeline and BigSky. And the way we're going to hear this is, rather than running it in the effects loop, which you could do, it sounds perfectly fine, but it would be in mono. I wanted to do this in stereo, so I'm running into my Waza tube amp expander and then coming out of there into my Strymon pedals and then into our audio interface. Of course, this amp is so affordable, you could have 2 of them and you could run a stereo D style rig if you wanted to be very extravagant and still not break the bank. We're not going to do that today, but we are going to listen to this with some stereo wet effects. So thus far, all of our testing has been fairly situational. We've explored some very specific tones. Let's do a more generalized look at how this amp sounds. And for this, we're going to do an examination of the controls on the front panel, and we'll explore them at their extremes. We'll explore all the various positions of the switches in a more forensic manner. We'll do this with the overdrive switched off. Then we'll switch the overdrive on and take a listen to how the preamp controls interact with the overdrive. But first, let's do a test with the overdrive disengaged. So there you go, folks. That's been a look at the VHT D-20. And I got to tell you, this is an amp that I could see having a home in my collection. I think it's an absolutely killer sounding little amplifier and gives me that D-style flavor that I don't really have in my collection so far. I think it's a really great sounding amp. I'm not going to pontificate on how much it sounds like an authentic Dumble, because first of all, every Dumble that was ever made sounds different because they were made for the player who owned it. But also, I've never owned a Dumble. I've only played one for a very, very short amount of time at an ear-splitting volume. I'm willing to bet you've probably never owned one either. And once again, as we mentioned, those folks on the internet who want to talk about how Dumbles sound, they've probably never owned one either. What I will say is this amp on its own merits sounds absolutely killer and is definitely in that ballpark family of the D-style amplifier. I've played a good few of those. I've played some Two-Rocks and I've played the Seriatone clones and all that sort of stuff. I think this amp really stacks up. Of course, we don't have anything to do direct A/B comparisons to, but to be completely honest with you, at the price this amp is coming in at, I will accept any slight differentiation in tone, and that's something that I can probably dial out with different speakers and all that sort of stuff anyway. The feel is great. It does all of the sounds that I expect from this type of amplifier. It does them exceptionally well, and it's super, super affordable compared to other D-style amplifiers in the market. Obviously, this is going to come in a little more expensive than a Boss Katana, but even still, in comparison to some of the high-end amps that are going after that Dumble tone, and compared to Dumbles themselves, if you can find one for sale, this amp is an absolute stone cold bargain. Once again, this is the VHT D-20. My name's Nick Jennison. I'm thinking about guitar. I'll see you next time.